The auction hall was cloaked in a tense, reverent silence, broken only by the muffled thud of boots on sawdust and the occasional snort of an anxious horse. Under the amber lights, in the center of the ring, stood a striking chestnut quarter horse, guided by a tall man with a long white beard and weathered face. His name was Ambrose Callahan, and though few knew it, this might be the last day he'd ever walk free. The horse beside him was no ordinary steed. This was Lucero, a purebred champion with a bloodline worth more than most could imagine. But what no one expected was that a man who had nothing left to lose was about to risk everything for one final moment of freedom. Ambrose had been a cowboy nearly all his life. Now, at 74, with late-stage cancer eating away at his bones, he had no possessions, no family, and precious little time. But seated in the very back row of that opulent wood-paneled auction house, his gaze wasn't on the millionaires or the bidders, it was locked on Lucero. With a gleaming coat and a white star on his forehead, the horse was a living symbol of strength, freedom, and grace. For Ambrose, he represented something deeper: the past. The feeling of wind in his face, of power beneath the saddle, of being alive before the pain took over. Trembling fingers held a crumpled note, the ink smudged from sweat and time. Ambrose had written it in the early hours, in the quiet of his rusted-out trailer. "Let me ride one last time, before I go." He wasn't there to buy. He couldn't even afford a motel room for the night. But he came, driven by something no money could buy, a final wish born from a lifetime spent chasing sunsets. The auctioneer's voice cut through the air like a whip. $100,000. Now $150. Do I hear $200? The numbers climbed fast, too fast. Each bid felt like another door slamming shut in Ambrose's face. But then, against all reason, he stood. Slowly, painfully. Heads turned. Whispers followed. An old man in threadbare denim, limping toward the ring as if he belonged there. His eyes never left the horse. Lucero turned his head. For a moment, their eyes met. And in that shared silence, something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or destiny. Ambrose reached out with frail hands and touched Lucero's muzzle. The horse didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, lowering his head to rest gently against the old man's chest. The crowd stilled. Near the front, Opal Green, a local journalist, lowered her camera. Her breath caught in her throat. She had covered hundreds of events like this. But never had she seen something that cut so deep, so unexpectedly, into the soul. Ambrose's voice was barely a whisper. "Just one ride, that's all I'm asking." The handler hesitated, glancing toward the auctioneer, but no one moved to stop him. And so, slowly, Ambrose was lifted into the saddle. The audience, once preoccupied with price tags and bloodlines, now watched in silence as the old cowboy rode. Lucero stepped forward, calm, deliberate, majestic. But in the far corner of the room, a man in a dark suit leaned toward a nearby security guard. His eyes narrowed as he pointed subtly toward Ambrose. Something about this man, this moment, didn't sit right with him. As Lucero carried Ambrose slowly around the ring, the audience remained utterly still. No applause, no murmurs, just the collective breath of a room that had forgotten how to exhale. Each hoofstep echoed like a heartbeat, steady and fragile. Ambrose sat straighter than he had in months. For a moment, the weight of his illness faded. His spine remembered what it meant to be strong. His muscles, frail though they were, aligned with the rhythm of the horse as if they were one soul moving through time. It wasn't just a ride. It was resurrection. But not everyone saw it that way. In the back corner, near the sound booth, Jared Langston, the man in the dark suit, spoke quietly into a headset. He was the event's financial director, a man known for having zero tolerance for disruption. His eyes never left Ambrose. There was something about the old man that rubbed him raw, something beyond the scene playing out in the ring. He tapped the security guard next to him and said, "Find out who he is." Now. The guard nodded and disappeared through a side door. Jared's jaw tightened. Something about this didn't add up. That horse was insured for more than a house in Manhattan. What if this was some kind of stunt? Outside the ring, Opal Green lowered her notebook and pressed her phone's record button without looking away. She could feel it. This was more than just a feel-good story. There was history behind this man. Pain. And maybe secrets. Her instinct as a journalist kicked in hard. She whispered to herself, "Who are you, Ambrose Callahan?" She needed to know. Not just for the article she would inevitably write, but because something about him reminded her of her father, a quiet man who died with more stories untold than shared. Meanwhile, Lucero stopped at the far end of the ring and turned his head slightly toward Ambrose, as if waiting for a command. Ambrose smiled softly, his hand brushing the horse's mane. "Good boy," he whispered. His eyes were glassy, not just from the illness, but from the swirl of memories overtaking him. He saw flashes of his youth, wild mustangs in Wyoming, his brother's dusty laugh on the ranch, the day he left home and never came back. For years, he'd avoided thinking about it. But now, on this final ride, everything came rushing back like a flood he could no longer hold back. Then the sound of boots, firm, rapid, broke the spell. 2 security guards stepped into the ring. The crowd stirred, murmuring. Ambrose turned his head slowly, confusion in his eyes. One of the guards approached him, speaking low but firm. "Sir, we're going to need you to dismount." The air shifted. Lucero snorted, sensing the tension. Ambrose gripped the saddle horn, his knuckles white. "I'm not here to steal anything," he said hoarsely. "I just needed this, just this." His voice cracked, but the guard didn't blink. "You're trespassing on a private auction floor." Opal stood abruptly, her voice rising. "You're throwing out a dying man?" All heads turned. The moment teetered on a knife's edge, between compassion and protocol, between justice and humiliation. Jared Langston stepped forward, adjusting his cufflinks with icy calm. "He's not on the guest list," he said. "And I don't care what story he's selling." But someone else cared, someone Ambrose never expected to see again. For a moment, Ambrose thought he was hallucinating. The lights above the auction floor shimmered, and the sound of voices felt distant, like he was underwater. But when he turned his head toward the commotion, his eyes locked onto something impossible. Standing just outside the main doors was a woman with silver blonde hair, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had aged, yes, but not enough to erase the memory burned into his mind. Her name escaped his lips in a dry whisper, "Catherine." The woman froze. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then slowly, her hands lifted to cover her mouth. The name, long buried in time and silence, had ripped through her like a sudden storm. Catherine Rosewood, once the daughter of the wealthiest horse breeder in Kentucky, and the woman Ambrose had loved and left more than 4 decades ago. He never thought he'd see her again. Not here. Not now. But there she was, unmistakably real. And judging by her eyes, she recognized him just as quickly. The guards paused, glancing at Jared for instructions. But even Jared looked momentarily shaken, sensing the shift in the room. Catherine stepped forward, her boots clicking with purpose on the wooden floor. "Wait," she said firmly, her voice clear and commanding. "Don't touch him." The guards looked to Jared again, uncertain. Catherine's presence was magnetic, not just from her reputation, but from something deeper. Authority. History. She walked past Opal, past the audience, straight into the ring. Ambrose blinked hard, trying to process the moment. His chest tightened, not just from illness, but from something older. Regret. Catherine stopped in front of Lucero and looked up at Ambrose with eyes full of complicated emotion. "You shouldn't be here," she said, but her voice trembled. He nodded. "I know." She glanced at Lucero, then back at Ambrose. "Why now?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Because I'm running out of time," he replied. Silence wrapped around them like fog. For a moment, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. Opal, still recording quietly in the background, didn't dare move. The guests, though restless, remained rooted in place, captivated by the scene unfolding. Jared, clearly losing control of the situation, stepped forward. "Ms. Rosewood, if you know this man," Catherine cut him off. "He's not just any man," she said. "He's the reason I stopped breeding horses for 15 years. Every head turned. Ambrose swallowed hard. His grip on the saddle loosened. Catherine's words hung in the air, laced with pain and mystery. She turned toward Jared and said something that made the room freeze once more. "You'll let him finish this ride, or you'll have to explain to the Rosewood family why you threw out the man who once saved our entire ranch." The silence in the auction hall became unbearable. Lucero shifted his weight beneath Ambrose, as if sensing the storm of emotion brewing above him. Catherine stood tall, eyes locked with Jared's. The mention of the Rosewood name carried weight, too much for even a man like Jared Langston to ignore. He hesitated, calculating, and then nodded stiffly to the guards. They stepped back, uncertain but obedient. The tension didn't lift, it simply shifted direction. Every person in the room now understood this wasn't just about a horse. It was about history, and something deeper, unspoken. Ambrose exhaled shakily, his throat dry. "I never thought I'd see you again," he murmured. Catherine didn't smile. Her eyes were glassy but guarded. "You weren't supposed to." Her voice was sharp, not from anger, but from old wounds. Opal stepped closer now, instinctively drawn to the story unraveling in real time. Her camera caught everything: the pain, the love, the years lost. To her, it was the kind of moment journalists prayed for. But to Ambrose, it felt like punishment. "You disappeared," Catherine said. "You left without a word. Do you know what that did to me? To my father." He nodded slowly, guilt etched deep into the lines of his face. "I know, and I regret it every damn day." His voice cracked under the weight of truth. "But if I had stayed, I would have ruined everything. I wasn't good enough, not for you, not for your family. And your father made sure I understood that." Catherine's face twitched. Pain flashed behind her eyes. "That wasn't your decision to make, Ambrose." He lowered his gaze. "Maybe not. But I made it anyway. And I paid for it." Lucero snorted softly, as if impatient with the human drama. The crowd remained still, watching something far more powerful than any auction, a reckoning decades in the making. Catherine took a step forward, placing a hand gently on Lucero's neck. "He remembers you," she said, almost to herself. "They say horses don't forget the scent of someone who once loved them." Ambrose looked down at her, surprised. "You think he knows me?" She nodded. "He was born on my land. The last colt my mother saw before she passed. We named him Lucero because he was our morning star. I raised him like a child. And when I sold the ranch, I never thought I'd see him again, either." The revelation hit Ambrose like a wave. "This is your horse?" Catherine nodded again. "Was. Until yesterday. The buyer backed out. He was supposed to be auctioned off today, but something in me couldn't let go. And now, here you are, sitting on him like you never left." Her voice broke. "Why now, Ambrose? Why come back just to die in front of me?" His eyes welled up. "Because I didn't come back for pity. I came back to face what I ran from. And maybe, to leave something behind that mattered." But just as Catherine opened her mouth to respond, the side doors of the auction hall creaked open again, and this time a young man in his late 20s entered, eyes searching the room until they landed on Ambrose. His face was pale, determined, familiar, and when Ambrose saw him, his whole body froze. Because that face, it was one he hadn't seen since the boy was a baby. Ambrose couldn't move. His breath caught in his chest as he stared at the young man slowly walking toward him, step by step, through the stunned silence of the auction hall. The boy, no, the man, had the same eyes. That deep, steady blue that Ambrose saw every morning in the mirror, and once, long ago, in a hospital crib. Catherine turned to look, then back at Ambrose, her face suddenly pale. "You never asked," she said quietly, almost accusing. "You just left." The young man stopped a few feet from Lucero, his jaw tight, fists clenched. "So it's true," he said, his voice calm but heavy. "You're him." Ambrose tried to speak but couldn't. His throat was dry, and words felt foreign in his mouth. Finally, he nodded. "I didn't know, not for sure," he said hoarsely. "Your mother never told me." Catherine took a sharp breath. "I did what I had to do. You were gone. You made that choice." The young man looked at her, then back at Ambrose. "I'm not here to fight. I just needed to see your face, once." Opal stood frozen, unsure if she should keep filming or lower her camera out of respect. Her instincts told her this was the heart of the story, but her conscience whispered that she was witnessing something sacred. The crowd had faded away now, mere shadows in the background. All that existed in that moment was a man on a horse, the woman he abandoned, and the son he never knew he had. Ambrose looked down at the young man, shame tightening around his ribs like a vice. "What's your name?" he asked. The young man hesitated. "Caleb. Caleb Rosewood." Ambrose let the name settle in his bones. A name with weight. Legacy. A name he should have known years ago. "I don't expect anything from you," Caleb continued. "I just wanted to see what kind of man disappears and leaves behind a life that never got to begin." The words cut deep, deeper than anything Jared or the cancer ever could. Catherine stepped between them slightly, her hand resting protectively on Lucero's side. "He came back, Caleb," she said softly. "Maybe too late, but he came back." Caleb's eyes didn't leave Ambrose. "Yeah," he said, "and maybe that's something." Then he turned to walk away. But before he reached the door, he paused. "There's a rodeo tomorrow, out near Franklin County. We're short one rider for the final flag run." He glanced over his shoulder. If the old man's got anything left, he's welcome to prove he's more than a ghost. Ambrose didn't respond. He couldn't. His hands trembled on the reins. His breath was shallow. And deep inside him, something cracked open. Not pain, not pride, but the first flicker of hope he'd felt in decades. That night, the wind outside the trailer howled like a warning. Inside, Ambrose sat alone at the edge of a narrow cot, staring at a pair of worn leather gloves resting on the table. His chest ached, not just from the illness eating at his lungs, but from the weight of Caleb's words. If the old man's got anything left, that wasn't just a challenge. It was an invitation. A crack in a wall Ambrose thought would never open. He hadn't felt this afraid in years. Not of death, but of living and failing. The next morning, the Franklin County rodeo grounds were already buzzing. Trucks rumbled across the lot, banners flapped in the breeze, and the smell of dust, hay, and grilled meat filled the air. Ambrose arrived just after sunrise, riding in the passenger seat of a ranch truck driven by Opal, who, despite her reporter instincts, had decided to stop documenting and start witnessing. She didn't speak much on the drive. She didn't have to. She could see the battle inside him, the quiet desperation of a man trying to gather the last fragments of his soul. Lucero was already there, waiting. The handlers remembered him from the auction and gave Ambrose space, nodding respectfully as he approached. The old cowboy placed a hand on the stall door and looked into Lucero's eyes. "You carried me once already," he whispered. "Think you've got one more in you?" The horse nudged his shoulder gently, as if answering without words. Ambrose smiled. It was a weak smile, but it was real. At the registration tent, Caleb stood in a faded denim jacket, clipboard in hand, pretending not to be nervous. When he saw Ambrose walking toward him, boots dragging slightly, but steady, something flickered behind his eyes. Pride, maybe. Or confusion. "You sure about this?" Caleb asked. Ambrose took a long breath. "No. But I'm sure I don't want to die wondering." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from an old campfire. Familiar, haunting, true. The flag run wasn't complicated, but it required speed, control, and timing. Riders had to charge down the arena, grab a flag from one barrel, and place it into another at the far end. It was symbolic, passing something from one point to the next. A message. A legacy. Ambrose mounted Lucero slowly, every movement deliberate, every bone in his body resisting. But once he was in the saddle, something changed. His spine straightened. His hands steadied. Caleb watched from the sidelines, arms crossed, jaw tight. And when the whistle blew, Lucero exploded forward like a bullet through time. Dust rose behind them in thick clouds as the crowd roared in surprise. Ambrose leaned forward, heart pounding, eyes locked on the first barrel. He reached out, the flag in his grip, and as he galloped toward the final post, he wasn't 74, or sick, or broken. He was just a rider, trying to finish something he started long ago. Halfway down the final stretch, something shifted inside Ambrose. A sharp, searing pain shot through his ribs, sudden and violent. He clenched his jaw and tightened his grip on the reins. Lucero felt the change instantly, hesitating for a single, crucial moment before pushing forward again. The flag in Ambrose's hand fluttered like a dying flame. The second barrel was just ahead. He was almost there. Almost. In the stands, Caleb stood frozen. What started as pride in his father's return had quickly turned into something else. Fear. He could see the tremble in Ambrose's shoulders, the unnatural lean in his posture. "Come on," he whispered under his breath. Opal, camera forgotten around her neck, was gripping the rail with white knuckles. Around them, the crowd had gone quiet. Not out of boredom, but because every eye sensed it. This wasn't a competition. This was something sacred. Ambrose gasped, his chest tightening like a vice. His vision blurred. His fingers numbed. He'd pushed too far. Too hard. And for a fleeting second, his mind screamed for him to stop, to let go, to fall, to surrender. But another voice, buried deep inside, fought back. "You asked for one more ride. This is it." Gritting his teeth, he leaned into Lucero, whispered, "Let's finish this," and lifted the flag with every ounce of strength left in his arms. Lucero surged. Dust kicked up like a storm cloud. The horse seemed to understand the urgency, pushing harder, faster, as if it wasn't just a race against time, but against death itself. The final barrel loomed. Ambrose reached out, hand trembling violently, and dropped the flag into the holder. It barely settled before he collapsed forward onto the horse's neck. He didn't fall. He held on, just long enough. As Lucero slowed to a trot, Ambrose's body began to slump. The announcer's voice cracked over the loudspeaker, "Ladies and gentlemen, he did it." A stunned applause broke out, hesitant at first, then thunderous. Caleb rushed into the arena, heart hammering, and caught his father just as he slipped from the saddle. Ambrose's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Did I make it?" he croaked. Caleb nodded, tears burning behind his eyes. "You made it. All the way." Ambrose tried to smile. "Told you. I had one more in me." And then, with the sound of cheers rising behind him, the weight of the world slid off his shoulders. His eyes closed. His head rested against Caleb's chest. For a moment, it was unclear whether he had passed out or passed on. But whatever happened next, the crowd knew they had witnessed something they'd never forget. For several terrifying seconds, Caleb couldn't feel his father breathing. He cradled Ambrose in his arms, his heart pounding louder than the rodeo crowd still roaring behind him. "Dad," he whispered for the first time in his life, a word he never imagined using, especially not here, like this. "Dad, stay with me." Lucero stood nearby, ears pinned back, pacing nervously. The dust in the arena began to settle, but nothing else did. Medics rushed in. One checked Ambrose's pulse while another shined a small light into his eyes. Caleb stood frozen, unable to move or speak. Opal was at the edge of the arena, her hands covering her mouth, eyes filled with tears. This wasn't the story she came to cover. It had become something else, something too close, too raw. "He's alive," one medic said finally. "But barely. We need to move now." The stretcher seemed too harsh, too impersonal, for a man who had just poured his soul into a final ride. As they lifted Ambrose carefully, Caleb walked alongside them, one hand on his father's shoulder. The touch felt unfamiliar, fragile, like holding something you weren't sure you deserved. Catherine had arrived by then, her heels crunching in the gravel as she ran across the arena. She looked between her son and the man she'd never stopped loving. "Ambrose," she whispered. Her voice cracked like dry wood. He stirred, barely. His eyes blinked open, only for a moment, and focused on her. "You're still beautiful," he rasped, a weak smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Catherine dropped to her knees beside the stretcher and gripped his hand. "Don't you dare leave like this again," she whispered. "Not without finishing what you started." Caleb watched, emotions tangling in his chest, grief, confusion, awe, and something dangerously close to forgiveness. At the hospital, the doctors did what they could. The diagnosis was still grim. Ambrose's organs were failing, and time was short. But he had survived the ride. That alone was a miracle. In the quiet room lit by a single lamp, Caleb sat by his bedside, hands folded, staring at the man who was once only a name in an old photograph. "Why did you come back?" he asked softly, not even sure if his father could hear. "Why now?" Ambrose's eyes opened slowly. His voice was barely audible, but the words hit like thunder. "Because I didn't want my last breath to be wasted on regret." A tear slipped down Caleb's cheek. He didn't respond. He just nodded, and stayed there, holding the hand of the father he never thought he'd meet, now hoping quietly that maybe this wasn't the end after all. The hospital room was quiet, dimly lit by a soft streak of morning light slipping through the blinds. Machines beeped steadily beside Ambrose's bed, their rhythm the only sound breaking the silence. Caleb sat nearby, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly. He hadn't left the room since the previous day. His eyes were tired, but his thoughts were louder than sleep would allow. Across from him, Ambrose looked more at peace than Caleb expected. Fragile, yes, and pale beneath the thin blanket, but somehow grounded. Like a man who had finally laid down a weight he'd carried too long. Caleb didn't know what to feel. For so many years, Ambrose had been a name in a story he resented, a myth he tried not to believe in. And now, that myth was lying in front of him, real and breathing, barely. Catherine entered the room without a word, carrying an old leather-bound photo album. She sat next to Caleb and opened it slowly, revealing black and white images of another life. Dusty ranch fields, faded barns, and a young Ambrose with bright eyes and a crooked smile. "He wasn't always the man who ran," she said quietly. "Once, he dreamed of building a life here. With me. With you." Caleb's eyes lingered on a photo of Ambrose holding a baby in a flannel blanket, wide-eyed and terrified, yet deeply human. "He came to see you the day you were born," Catherine whispered. "Held you for 10 minutes. Then walked out without a word." Caleb's fingers touched the photo. His jaw clenched, but he didn't look away. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Catherine sighed. "Because I didn't want you growing up wondering why he left. I thought maybe it was kinder to let the silence stay. But silence had a way of growing heavy, of becoming a wall too tall to climb." That afternoon, Ambrose stirred. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "You stayed," he said. Caleb nodded. "I had questions." A faint smile crossed Ambrose's face. "I deserve them." They didn't talk about the pain, not directly. Instead, they talked about horses, weather, broken fences, and stubborn pride. It wasn't enough to heal everything, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start is all a man has time for. The days that followed were quiet, slower, as if the world outside the hospital room knew something sacred was unfolding behind its walls. Ambrose didn't get stronger. The doctors had been honest about that. But he was lucid, clear. And in those fleeting windows of time, he found something he never expected to: peace. Caleb came every day. He brought stories, small things, memories of the ranch Catherine once sold, stories he'd heard from neighbors, from rodeo friends. And Ambrose listened like it was scripture. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he cried quietly. But mostly, he just listened, as if he were filling in the blank pages of a book he never got to write. Catherine was there too. She sat on the edge of the bed, reading aloud from old letters Ambrose had once written but never sent. Letters she found tucked away in a rusted box buried deep in the barn. In those words were apologies, confessions, and dreams he never had the courage to speak. She didn't read them to shame him. She read them to remind him he was loved, even when he thought he wasn't. On Ambrose's last morning, the air was still. The sun peeked through the hospital window, casting golden light across the white sheets. Lucero, kept nearby in a stable donated by the hospital groundskeeper, who had watched the flag run on television, neighed softly outside, almost like a farewell. Ambrose, eyes closed, whispered one last sentence as Caleb held his hand. "You gave me more than a second chance. You gave me a place to rest." There were no dramatic goodbyes. No final speeches. Just a long, slow breath, and silence. And when it came, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like release. Catherine pressed her lips gently to Ambrose's forehead. Caleb stood tall, tears on his cheeks, not from regret, but from gratitude. A man he never knew had become a father, if only for a little while. Weeks later, Caleb rode Lucero one last time, across a quiet pasture at sunrise. He carried a small wooden box with his father's ashes, and when he reached the highest hill, he opened it to the wind. "Ride easy, old man," he whispered. And in the morning light, it felt like Ambrose never really left at all.